On July 2, 1943, Castell Vetrano Airfield, Sicily. The summer sky shimmered above the Mediterranean like a polished blade. Heat rose off the runways in wavering curtains, distorting the distant hills. In that still air, a lone Focke-Wulf, 190, prowled for targets, its pilot confident, experienced, and utterly unaware of what waited above him. From the brilliant glare of the sun, a dark shape dropped like a hawk. It was a P-40 Warhawk, engines screaming as it dove from altitude. The German pilot never had a chance to react. Streams of .50 caliber tracers erupted from the American fighter's wings, lancing through the sky. They smashed into the 190's fuselage, ripping metal, shattering control surfaces, and turning the aircraft into a tumbling fireball. The German machine spiraled downward, trailing black smoke, vanishing into the parched Sicilian countryside below. At the controls sat First Lieutenant Charles B. Hull, a 22-year-old from Brazil, Indiana. That brief encounter, over in seconds, made history. Hull had just become the first black American pilot to shoot down an enemy aircraft in combat. On the side of Hull's P-40 ground crews would paint a swastika kill mark, the first of what would eventually become 112 confirmed aerial victories credited to the Tuskegee Airmen. Across Nazi Germany, pilots would soon speak in a mix of fear and begrudging respect of Schwarze-Vogel-Menschen, the Black Birdmen. For the Luftwaffe High Command, Hull's victory was more than a tactical setback. It was a crack in the ideological armor of Nazi racial doctrine. In Hitler's Germany, black people were officially labeled Untermensch, subhuman, incapable of complex thought, courage, or technological mastery. Their laws had banned interracial marriage. Their propaganda dismissed black soldiers as inferior curiosities. And yet, above Sicily that day, a young man from Indiana had proved that their carefully constructed myth was fragile. All it took was one perfectly aimed burst of gunfire. That moment was only the beginning. Over the next 2 years, a group of black pilots trained in Alabama would defy both foreign hatred and domestic prejudice, dismantling stereotypes in the skies over Europe. Their story is not merely one of dogfights and missions. It is the story of how courage, discipline, and excellence rewrote history, one sortie at a time. Before these young pilots faced the Luftwaffe, they had already spent their lives fighting another, quieter battle, one waged not in the skies, but in the classrooms, offices, and institutions of their own country. Long before Charles Hull's Warhawk roared through the Sicilian air, systemic barriers were being built to ensure people like him would never sit in a cockpit. In 1925, the U.S. Army War College issued a report titled The Employment of Negro Manpower in War. Its language was cold, clinical, and devastatingly clear. The document claimed that, compared to white men, black Americans were intellectually inferior, lacked the courage for leadership, and were unfit for complex technical roles. In short, the military declared that they could not be trusted with machines, strategy, or command. This was not the opinion of a fringe group. It was official military doctrine, circulated at the highest levels. These words justified decades of exclusion, keeping black servicemen confined to support roles, digging trenches, cooking meals, repairing equipment, but never flying planes or leading men into combat. America, in the early 20th century, was a land of contradictions. It called itself the defender of liberty, yet practiced segregation by law. Jim Crow statutes enforced separation in schools, transportation, even drinking fountains. Lynchings and racial terror were still grim realities in many parts of the country. Black ambition, no matter how skilled or driven, was hemmed in by walls built of prejudice and bureaucracy. And yet, even in that hostile environment, some refused to accept those walls. In World War I, Eugene Bullard had crossed the Atlantic to fight for France because the U.S. military wouldn't let him fly. He earned distinction as a combat pilot in the French Air Service, decades before his own country would acknowledge such a possibility. In 1921, Bessie Coleman became the first black woman to earn a pilot's license. No American flight school would take her, so she learned French, traveled to Paris, and trained at the prestigious Caudron Brothers Aviation School. She returned home as a symbol of defiance, performing daring air shows to inspire others who had been told no all their lives. By the 1930s, small cracks in the wall began to appear. The Coffey School of Aeronautics in Chicago started training black civilian pilots, producing skilled aviators who proved that talent was not determined by skin color. Their achievements were undeniable, but the U.S. military establishment ignored them. The official stance remained unchanged. Black men would not fly combat aircraft. This was the world that young black Americans grew up in. A world where excellence often went unrecognized, where opportunity required not just talent, but extraordinary persistence. And yet, as war clouds thickened over Europe, those walls were about to be tested by forces far greater than anyone in Washington could control. By the late 1930s, the world was changing fast across the Atlantic. Dictators armed their nations for conquest. In the United States, the gears of industry began to turn toward war, and within Black America, pressure for inclusion built with unstoppable force. Activists, journalists, and community leaders saw the looming conflict not only as a global struggle, but as a chance to confront their own country's hypocrisy. The NAACP, under the leadership of Walter White, relentlessly lobbied the Roosevelt administration to open opportunities for black servicemen in aviation. Labor leader A. Philip Randolph, founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, understood the leverage of organized pressure. He threatened mass demonstrations and political consequences if the government continued to deny black citizens a fair share of defense jobs and military roles. Judge William H. Hastie, a brilliant legal mind, worked inside the system, advising the War Department and challenging discriminatory policies from within. Outside Washington, black newspapers became the megaphone of a rising movement. Publications like the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, and the Baltimore Afro-American published editorials and headlines that pierced through polite political rhetoric. Their message was sharp and simple. How can America claim to defend democracy overseas while denying it at home? This was not just a slogan, it was a moral indictment. And in a nation preparing for war, moral indictments mattered. The first cracks appeared in 1939 when Public Law 18 was passed. On its surface, it was modest. It required that at least one civilian flight school be designated for the training of black pilots. But beneath that cautious language lay something revolutionary, a legal acknowledgement that black Americans had the right to fly. It wasn't equality, not yet, but it was a breach in the wall. Then came politics. As Franklin D. Roosevelt prepared for an unprecedented third presidential campaign in 1940, he recognized the electoral power of black voters in key northern cities. Their support was crucial. Civil rights leaders knew this too, and they pressed their advantage. Inclusion in military aviation became not just a moral demand, but a political bargaining chip. Their efforts bore fruit. On January 16, 1941, the War Department officially announced the formation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first all-black flying unit in U.S. history. The announcement was groundbreaking, but it came laced with condescension. Military leaders referred to it as an experiment, implying that failure was expected. Their words revealed everything about the era's mindset. They weren't convinced black pilots could handle combat, but they were willing to test the idea under controlled conditions. Command of this new unit fell to Captain Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr., a man uniquely shaped for the role, the son of America's first black general. Davis had endured 4 years of near-total social isolation at West Point. White cadets refused to speak to him outside of official duties. He graduated without ever having a single roommate or friend. Yet he never broke discipline. He excelled academically and militarily, driven by a quiet, unwavering sense of purpose. Now, in his early 30s, he was tasked with leading 26 black pilots into uncharted territory, carrying the expectations of millions on his shoulders. The seeds were sown. Legal cracks, political leverage, community pressure, and exceptional individuals converging at a pivotal moment in history. The war in Europe was escalating, and soon these seeds would be tested in the unforgiving crucible of aerial combat. In the spring of 1943, after years of battling prejudice at home and skepticism within the military, the 99th Pursuit Squadron finally crossed the Atlantic. Their destination, North Africa, where Allied forces were preparing to push the Axis out of the Mediterranean, for the men of Tuskegee. This was the moment they had been waiting for. But they were entering not just a theater of war. They were stepping onto a stage where every action would be scrutinized. The squadron arrived at Farjona, Tunisia, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William W. Maumier, a commander who made little effort to hide his doubts about black pilots. To Maumier and many others, the 99th was an unproven experiment, something to be tolerated rather than trusted. Instead of frontline missions, they were assigned patrol duties over stretches of the Mediterranean. Important work, but far from the dramatic air battles happening elsewhere. These assignments reflected the military's skepticism. If the 99th failed here, commanders could point and say, "See, we gave them a chance." Behind the scenes, pressure was immense. Every pilot knew that his performance was not just his own. It was a referendum on the capabilities of an entire race. One mistake could confirm every racist expectation. One victory could shatter them. Their baptism of fire came on June 2, 1943, during an attack on the Italian-held island of Pantelleria, a strategically placed fortress between Tunisia and Sicily. The mission was to escort bombers and keep them safe from German fighters. As their worn P-40 Warhawks climbed into the skies, the pilots' nerves were stretched tight. Suddenly, enemy aircraft appeared. German fighters approached, fast and aggressive. For a heartbeat, time seemed to slow, and then the sky erupted into a swirl of turning aircraft, tracer fire, and engine roar. The Tuskegee pilots held formation, protecting the bombers with iron discipline. No aircraft were lost on either side, but something more important had happened. The Germans had expected these experimental pilots to break under pressure. They didn't. They held the line. Then came July 2, 1943, the day everything changed. Lieutenant Charles B. Hull, flying his 8th mission, was escorting BUO's 25 bombers headed for Castell Vetrano Airfield in Sicily. As the bombers released their payload, two Focke-Wulf 190 SEP pounced on the formation, aiming to pick off stragglers. Hull spotted them. "I saw two Focke-Wulfs following the bombers just after the bombs were dropped," he later recalled. "I headed for the space between the fighters and the bombers and managed to turn inside the Jerries. I fired a long burst and saw my tracers penetrate the second aircraft. He was turning to the left, but suddenly fell off and headed straight into the ground." His guns found their mark. One German fighter went down in flames. When Hull landed, the entire base erupted in celebration. Black ground crews, who had endured months of slights and condescension from white personnel, finally had an answer for every insult. Hull's victory was more than personal. It was symbolic. He had just scored the first aerial kill by a black American pilot in U.S. military history. Despite this success, skepticism persisted. In January 1944, Colonel Maumier filed a damaging report, claiming the squadron lacked aggressiveness and recommending their removal from combat. His words carried weight. The future of the Tuskegee experiment hung by a thread, but history was about to intervene on a beachhead south of Rome. By early 1944, the 99th Pursuit Squadron had been flying combat missions for several months. They had patrolled, escorted, and engaged in scattered skirmishes. They had tasted victory through Charles Hall's historic kill, but they had also endured relentless skepticism from within their own military. Then, in January 1944, a moment arrived that would decide their fate, the Battle of Anzio. Before Anzio, the squadron's future teetered on a knife's edge. Colonel William Maumier, still unconvinced of their abilities, submitted a report to General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces. In it, he claimed that the 99th lacked aggressiveness and combat effectiveness. His conclusion was blunt. The experiment should be terminated, and the squadron pulled from the front lines. Arnold took this report seriously. The 99th was still an experiment, and if senior commanders declared it a failure, years of hard-fought progress could be erased overnight. The Tuskegee Airmen were about to be judged not only on their performance, but on entrenched prejudice disguised as military evaluation. Then came Anzio, a beachhead just south of Rome. On January 27, 1944, German forces launched a fierce counterattack to crush the Allied invasion. The Luftwaffe struck back with a wave of fighter and bomber raids, aiming to drive the Allies into the sea. For the 99th, this was the crucible. 15 Tuskegee pilots, flying their aging P-40 Warhawks, took to the air against superior German aircraft, the sleek and deadly Focke-Wulf 190 ses. On paper, the matchup was uneven. The P-40 was slower, less maneuverable at altitude, and technologically outclassed. But what the Tuskegee pilots lacked in machinery, they made up for in training, discipline, and sheer determination. The sky over Anzio turned into a violent ballet. German fighters swept in, attacking bombers and ground positions. The 99th responded with precision. They engaged, held formation, and struck back. In 2 days of intense combat, sources report they shot down between 8 and 13 enemy aircraft, more victories than in their previous 7 months combined. Lieutenant Charles Hall added 2 more kills to his record, bringing his total to 3. Other pilots also distinguished themselves in the chaotic, swirling dogfights over the beaches. The results spoke louder than any report. In the aftermath of Anzio, the War Department ordered a comparative study between the 99th and other P-40 squadrons. The data showed what the pilots had known all along. They were performing just as well as their white counterparts. The accusations of timidity were disproven, not by argument, but by the cold mathematics of combat. The Anzio victory silenced many critics, though not all, but it marked a turning point. The Tuskegee Airmen were no longer seen merely as a social experiment. They had proven themselves in blood and fire, in one of the toughest aerial battles of the Mediterranean campaign. Their reward was not rest, but elevation. In May 1944, the 99th was merged with 3 other black squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, to form the 332nd Fighter Group. This new unit would be tasked with some of the most demanding missions of the war, long-range bomber escort deep into Nazi Germany, under the command of now Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. The men prepared to take on a role that would etch their name into military legend. They had survived skepticism, endured prejudice, and triumphed in combat. Now they would fly further, fight harder, and protect lives on a scale no one had expected of them. The spring of 1944 marked a dramatic transformation for the Tuskegee Airmen. What began as a single experimental squadron had now become a fully fledged fighting group, the 332nd Fighter Group, composed of the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. Their new mission would take them from local patrols to the very heart of Hitler's fortress, bomber escort deep into enemy territory. The 15th Air Force, based in Italy, was tasked with strategic bombing raids on German factories, refineries, and military infrastructure. These missions were crucial to crippling the Nazi war machine. But the bombers, Lumbering B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were slow, vulnerable, and often forced to fly hundreds of miles through hostile skies. For years, bomber crews had suffered horrific losses. German fighters, operating in packs, would ambush them over the Alps and the Danube, tearing formations apart. Escort fighters often chased after German planes, leaving bombers exposed. Crews had a bitter saying, "The bombers go in alone." The 332nd's task was simple in words, brutal in reality. Protect the bombers at all costs. This was where reputations were made or destroyed. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Oka Davis, Jr. understood the stakes. He gathered his pilots at their base in Ramatelli, a rough airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast. The conditions were Spartan: mud, tents, makeshift facilities. But the mission was monumental. Davis laid down his rule with clarity. "We cannot afford to lose bombers. Our job is not to be aces. Our job is to bring those bombers home." This simple order would become the cornerstone of the Red Tails' combat philosophy. They would never abandon their bombers, no matter how tempting a dogfight might be. While other groups often broke formation to chase German fighters and rack up personal kills, the 332nd stayed with their charges. It was a strategy born of discipline, not ego. In June 1944, General Nathan Twining implemented a system to identify fighter groups by distinctive paint schemes. The 332nd was assigned a bold, unmistakable marking, bright red tails, along with red propeller spinners and nosebands. Their P-51D Mustangs, sleek and fast, with long-range capability, were transformed into flying symbols. As they soared above bomber formations, their crimson tails flashed in the sun, a reassuring sight to the men below. Bomber crews soon gave them a nickname that would stick forever: the Red Tails. At first, most bomber crews didn't know that the pilots guarding them were black. The only thing that mattered was their behavior in combat. These escorts didn't wander off. They didn't leave stragglers behind. They flew tight, disciplined formations, weaving above the bombers like hawks. Word began to spread through the bomber wings. If you can get the Red Tails, get them. They sell, bring you home. By the summer of 1944, the Red Tails were regularly flying deep penetration missions into Austria, Hungary, and Germany. They escorted bomber streams attacking oil refineries, aircraft factories, and rail yards, targets that were heavily defended and strategically critical. The Luftwaffe responded with everything they had experienced: fighter groups, aggressive tactics, and overwhelming numbers. The Red Tails held their ground. They weren't chasing glory. They were changing the odds of survival for thousands of bomber crewmen. Each successful mission strengthened their reputation. Each bomber that returned because of their protection became a silent testament to their discipline. July 18, 1944 became one of the fiercest tests of this doctrine. Colonel Davis led 66 Mustangs to rendezvous with bombers targeting a Luftwaffe base at Memmingen, Germany. The bombers were late, forcing the Red Tails to circle deep in enemy airspace, vulnerable and waiting. When the bombers finally arrived, so did nearly 100 German fighters, attacking from multiple directions. It was chaos. The Red Tails engaged ferociously, claiming 11 to 12 victories in the swirling combat. But the bombers suffered heavy losses. 15 B-17s went down in just 20 minutes. 3 Red Tail pilots, Lieutenants Robert Hutton, Wellington Irving, and Alfred Brown, were killed. Critics pounced, claiming the losses proved black pilots couldn't handle major engagements. But operational reports told the real story: the 332nd had been placed in an impossible tactical position. Their fierce defense likely prevented a massacre. By late 1944, bomber crews had become the Red Tails' most loyal advocates. To them, these pilots were not symbols of a social experiment. They were lifelines. Rumors and stories spread between airfields, of fighters who waggled their wings in greeting, of escorts who refused to abandon damaged bombers, of disciplined formations that didn't break. The myth was being written in real time, in smoke trails and contrails across the European sky. By early 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final, furious phase. The Luftwaffe was bloodied but not broken. Allied bombers now reached deep into Germany with devastating frequency, and the Red Tails had become a crucial part of that offensive. Their reputation for discipline and protection was now legendary among bomber crews. But Germany still had one last trump card, a weapon unlike anything the Allies had faced before. The Messerschmitt Me 262 was the world's first operational jet fighter. Sleek, fast, and futuristic, it could fly at over 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied propeller-driven aircraft. It climbed faster, dove harder, and could appear and vanish like a phantom. For Allied bomber crews, the appearance of the Me-262 was terrifying. Conventional escorts could barely keep up, and intercepting jets required both cunning and precision. By March 1945, as the Nazi regime collapsed on the ground, jet squadrons were Germany's desperate bid to regain control of the skies. On March 24, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group received orders for its most ambitious mission yet: escort bombers on a 600-mile round trip to Berlin to attack the Daimler-Benz tank factory, a critical target near the heart of the Reich. Intelligence reports warned that Me-262 jets from Jagdgeschwader 7, Germany's premier jet unit, would defend the area. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. led 43 P-51 Mustangs into the mission. For the Red Tails, this was not just another escort, it was a chance to prove themselves against Germany's most advanced technology. They would be tested against the future of aerial warfare. As they neared Berlin, shimmering silver shapes appeared on the horizon. Dozens of Me-262 says, their engines emitting a distinct, eerie whine, closed in on the bomber formation. This was the largest jet fighter interception of the entire war. The odds were daunting. The Red Tails had studied the Me-262 SIPS's weaknesses carefully. Though incredibly fast in level flight, the jets were sluggish in turns, especially at lower speeds, and vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, a sharp tactician and skilled flyer, explained their strategy later. "We knew the German jets were faster than we were. Instead of going directly after them, we went away from them and then turned into their blind spots." The Mustangs maneuvered cleverly, cutting off escape routes and exploiting moments when the jets slowed down to engage bombers. Brown spotted a 262 in a climbing turn. He pulled up at a 15-degree angle and fired 3 long bursts from 2,000 feet away. His rounds slammed into the jet. The German pilot bailed out as the aircraft spiraled down from 24,500 feet. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Earl Lane achieved what many considered nearly impossible. He shot down an Me-262 with a 2,000-yard deflection shot, using the new K-14 computing gun sight to anticipate the jet's future position. It was a feat of precision and nerve. Lieutenant Charles Brantley claimed the third jet kill of the day, turning what could have been a slaughter into a moment of triumph. In a single engagement, the Red Tails had destroyed 3 German jets, more than many fighter groups managed in the entire war. The success of the Berlin mission stunned both Allied commanders and bomber crews. The Red Tails had faced the Luftwaffe's most advanced weapon and won decisively. For their actions that day, the 332nd Fighter Group received a Distinguished Unit Citation, one of the highest honors that could be awarded to a combat unit. More than just a medal, this citation represented vindication. These were the same men who had once been labeled an experiment. They were now escorting bombers to Berlin and defeating Germany's most fearsome fighters. For the Luftwaffe, the encounter was a sobering blow. The myth of their jet invincibility was shattered. For the Allies, Bomber crews returned with renewed faith in the red-tailed fighters who had guided them through flak and fury. The Red Tails' victory over Berlin was more than a tactical success. It was a symbolic triumph. It marked the moment when a group that had once been dismissed and doubted stood toe-to-toe with history and changed it. By late 1944, the Tuskegee Airmen had become a constant presence in the skies over Europe. Their red-tailed Mustangs were feared by German pilots and revered by Allied bomber crews. But not every mission ended in victory. Aerial warfare was brutal, unpredictable, and often deadly. For some red-tail pilots, the fight did not end when their planes went down. Their next battle would unfold behind barbed wire, in German prisoner-of-war camps, where the contradictions of ideology and reality collided in unexpected ways. August 12, 1944. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson, flying his 19th mission, was strafing radar installations over southern France. The mission had begun like many others, a long flight over hostile territory, followed by a precise low-altitude attack. But this time, fate intervened. Anti-aircraft fire ripped through his P-51 Mustang. The aircraft shuddered, instruments failed, and black smoke filled the cockpit. Jefferson had no choice. He pulled the canopy release, felt the blast of cold air, and bailed out. As his parachute deployed, he watched his Mustang spiral earthward, a flaming arrow vanishing into the French countryside. He hit the ground hard. Within minutes, German soldiers surrounded him, rifles raised. The mission was over. His war had entered a new and dangerous chapter. Jefferson was taken to an interrogation center, where he encountered something chilling. The German officer, questioning him, had startlingly detailed intelligence on the 332nd Fighter Group. The interrogator knew about Ramitelli Airfield, our squadron commanders, even details about my parents' SIFT home in Detroit. Jefferson later recalled. He knew my father was a teacher and my mother SIP's maiden name. Their intelligence was frighteningly thorough. The Luftwaffe had tracked the Red Tails' activities closely. Despite Nazi racial ideology branding black people as inferior, the German military recognized their effectiveness. They knew these were elite pilots, and they treated them accordingly, as dangerous enemies, not curiosities. Jefferson was eventually sent to Stalag Luft III, a POW camp in Sagan, Germany, the same camp later made famous by the Great Escape. Inside the camp, Jefferson experienced something that would stay with him for the rest of his life: a shift in racial dynamics. Among fellow American prisoners, bomber crewmen, officers, navigators, the segregation that defined life in the United States suddenly evaporated. White prisoners, many of whom had flown missions under Red Tail escort, recognized him immediately. They approached with gratitude, shaking his hand, thanking him and his fellow pilots for their protection in the skies. These interactions, Jefferson reflected, were impossible in segregated America. But in a Nazi POW camp, they happened naturally. The irony was stark and painful. In enemy territory under Nazi guards, Jefferson found more equality among captured Americans than he did in his own country. Being a POW was still grueling. Food was scarce, winters were bitter, and boredom was relentless. Prisoners relied on Red Cross parcels and ingenuity to survive. For Jefferson and others, mental resilience became their greatest weapon. They endured interrogations, isolation, and uncertainty about whether they would live to see liberation. Yet, even within this hardship, the respect they received from fellow prisoners contrasted sharply with the discrimination waiting for them back home. The Luftwaffe may have been their enemy, but their fellow American officers were no longer segregating mess halls or barracks. Here, they were all simply airmen. When the war ended in 1945 and Allied forces liberated the camps, Jefferson and other captured Tuskegee pilots returned to a country that still refused to fully recognize their service. At the disembarkation point in the United States, they were immediately segregated once again. White soldiers went one way, black soldiers another. After months of shared hardship behind barbed wire, the old walls of prejudice were waiting for them at the docks. It was a cruel reminder: while Nazi Germany had been defeated, racism in America had not. Ironically, it was often German pilots and bomber crews who acknowledged the Red Tails' prowess more openly than their American counterparts. Luftwaffe flyers reportedly gave them the nickname Schwarz-Vogelmännchen, the Black Birdmen, a grudging nod to their skill and effectiveness. Meanwhile, in the U.S., many white Americans didn't even know black fighter pilots existed. The War Department rarely publicized their achievements, preferring to keep the Tuskegee experiment a quiet footnote rather than a headline. For men like Jefferson, this was a bitter pill. They had faced the enemy, survived captivity, and won respect in the most unlikely of places, only to return to a society determined to minimize their contribution. To the men who flew inside the cold, cramped fuselages of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, the sky was both a highway and a battlefield. Every mission over Europe meant flying through a deadly gauntlet, flak bursts that could shred aluminum, German fighters diving in from the sun, and the endless uncertainty of whether today would be the day their luck finally ran out. And then, out of the blue horizon, they'd see them red tails slicing through the air, sliding into escort positions like sentinels. For countless bomber crews, that sight meant one thing: hope. Bomber crews had a saying: the bombers always go in alone. For years, that was bitter truth. Escort fighters often abandoned their charges to chase enemy kills, leaving bombers exposed to swarming German interceptors. But the Red Tails were different. They stayed. They guarded. They didn't peel off for glory. They flew with a discipline that bomber crews came to trust with their lives. Inside a B-17's cramped cockpit, pilots would watch the Red Tails sliding into position. 3 layers of protection: close escort weaving directly above, medium escort intercepting incoming fighters, and high escort scanning for diving attacks. The precision was breathtaking. The discipline absolute. Word spread quickly through bomber groups: if you can get the Red Tails, get them. They sit, they'll bring you home. The bomber crews began to develop their own mythology about the Red Tails. They weren't just pilots, they were Red Tail angels. Crews talked about the way the Mustangs would waggle their wings in greeting before settling in for the long, perilous flight north. They told stories about how the Red Tails refused to leave crippled bombers behind, circling damaged aircraft until they limped back to safety. These stories weren't exaggerations. They were acts of quiet heroism, repeated day after day. For the bombermen, whose missions often involved flying for 8 to 10 hours through freezing temperatures and deadly skies, the Red Tails became something more than escorts. They were symbols of reliability, the one variable in a chaotic war they could count on. The statistics eventually proved what the bomber crews already knew in their bones. Research by Air Force historian Dr. Daniel Hullman revealed that under Red Tail escort, bombers lost only 27 aircraft to enemy fighters. The average loss rate for other escort groups in the 15th Air Force was 46. This wasn't a fluke. It was the result of discipline, strategy, and unrelenting focus. Even though the Red Tails often flew some of the longest and most dangerous missions of the war, their protection record was unmatched. Behind these numbers were human lives, entire bomber crews who returned home because the Red Tails refused to leave their side. A bomber crew might never meet the men in those crimson-tailed Mustangs, but they owed them everything. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. understood something fundamental in strategic bombing. The objective was not dogfighting, but ensuring bombers reached their targets and returned. He drilled this into his pilots relentlessly. Anyone can shoot down a fighter if they abandon their post. Davis told them, it takes discipline to stay with the bombers when the enemy is running. The Red Tails developed escort tactics that reflected this philosophy. Their 3-layered defense system, created a protective dome over bomber formations. While German fighters often tried to lure escorts away, the Tuskegee pilots refused the bait. Their goal was never individual glory, it was collective survival. For many bomber crewmen, the Red Tails became almost mythical figures. They rarely interacted on the ground, but in the air there was a silent bond forged by shared danger. Crews would watch the Mustangs dart and weave, intercepting enemy fighters with surgical precision. They saw the flashes of gunfire, the twisting dogfights just outside their windows, and they understood those men were fighting so that they could live. After missions, bomber crews often gathered in smoky mess halls and recounted what they had seen. "Did you see those red tails today? They stuck with us the whole way back. Never left our wing. I swear, when I saw them above us, I knew we were going to make it." The Red Tails' reputation spread not through official reports, but through the whispered gratitude of men who survived because of them. By the end of the war, bomber crews were among the loudest and most passionate defenders of the Tuskegee Airmen. While politicians debated and military officials hesitated to publicize their achievements, the bombermen needed no convincing. They had flown with the Red Tails. They had lived because of them. By the spring of 1945, the numbers spoke louder than any prejudice. What had begun as a begrudging experiment to see whether black pilots could handle combat had turned into one of the most resounding refutations of racism in U.S. military history. The Tuskegee Airmen had not only proven themselves, they had excelled in some of the most demanding aerial missions of World War II. Their story wasn't just about courage, it was about competence, discipline, and excellence under fire. The statistics were staggering. 15,000 combat sorties, 1,578 missions, 112 enemy aircraft shot down in aerial combat, 150 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 950 rail cars, trucks, and motor vehicles destroyed. 254 locomotives eliminated. One Italian destroyer damaged beyond repair. Their bomber escort record was unmatched. Only 27 bombers lost to enemy fighters under their protection, compared to an average of 46 for other P-51 groups in the 15th Air Force. These weren't isolated victories. This was a sustained, disciplined campaign that forced even the most skeptical commanders to confront reality. Nazi ideologues who believed black pilots were subhuman had seen their elite fighters shot down by them. American officers who doubted their ability were forced to reckon with numbers that didn't lie. The Tuskegee program itself was brutal, and intentionally so. The washout rate at Tuskegee was around 60%, compared to about 40% for white cadets. Only the most resilient, intelligent, and skilled survived the program. Cadets at Tuskegee Army Airfield logged more than 300 flying hours on average, a full 100 hours more than their white counterparts. They practiced formation flying obsessively, drilled emergency procedures until they were reflexive, and pushed themselves to the absolute limit. Colonel Noel Parrish, the white base commander who oversaw the program, later described the graduates as a super-selected group, men who had endured far more scrutiny, obstacles, and pressure than typical pilots, and emerged sharper because of it. At the beginning, the Tuskegee squadrons were given hand-me-down P-40 Warhawks, rugged, reliable, but already obsolete compared to the German Bf. 109 SES and FW 190S. The Warhawk was slower and less agile in climbs, but it could turn tightly and take heavy damage. Tuskegee pilots used those strengths masterfully, learning to exploit the P-40's maneuverability in defensive fights. They compensated for their aircraft's shortcomings with discipline and tactical intelligence. But everything changed in July 1944 when they received P-50 1D Mustangs, the crown jewel of American fighter design. With a Packard-built Merlin engine, the Mustang could cruise over 1,600 miles with drop tanks and fly at 437 miles per hour. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns could rip through any Luftwaffe plane. Now the Red Tails weren't just good pilots, they were flying top-tier machines, and their performance soared accordingly. Behind every red tail in the sky were dozens of men on the ground, mechanics, armorers, and crew chiefs, who kept those Mustangs flying in harsh conditions. Castell Airfield in Italy was primitive compared to other Allied bases. Spare parts were scarce, and the 332nd Fighter Group was often last in line for supplies. But through ingenuity and relentless work, their aircraft availability rate, the percentage of planes ready to fly at any time, equaled or exceeded that of white units with better resources. These ground crews performed miracles daily, repairing battle-damaged Mustangs, scavenging parts, and working through air raids. In one German bombing attack in March 1944, several support personnel were killed, but the crews kept pulling aircraft away from burning fuel dumps, even as bombs fell around them. Their contributions were rarely celebrated in headlines, but without them, the Red Tails would never have taken off. The Tuskegee Airmen fought two wars simultaneously, one against fascism abroad and another against segregation and prejudice at home. Their combat performance didn't just challenge Nazi racial ideology, it demolished American military myths about black inferiority. They forced the U.S. Army Air Forces, and eventually the American public, to confront evidence that couldn't be explained away by bias or ignored as coincidence. For the first time, the argument wasn't theoretical. It was written in kill counts, escort records, and mission reports. It was undeniable. Victory in Europe brought celebration for many units, but for the Tuskegee Airmen, it was followed by uncertainty. While white fighter groups prepared for parades, the 332nd faced a different reality. America's military still intended to maintain segregation, despite overwhelming evidence of their excellence. Their achievements were largely ignored by mainstream media. Black newspapers hailed their victories, but official military communiques often downplayed or buried their success. Many Americans had no idea black pilots had escorted bombers deep into Germany or shot down jets over Berlin. The pilots themselves returned quietly. There were no triumphant banners waiting, only the same segregated facilities and discriminatory policies they had left behind. Their heroism abroad hadn't changed the prejudice at home. For many veterans, this silence was painful. Lee Archer, one of the most successful pilots with 4 confirmed victories, worked in corporate America after the war, but rarely spoke of his service. "Nobody believed me anyway," he later said. "A black fighter pilot must be lying." Their combat records were real, but their stories faded into obscurity for decades. Recognition came slowly, too slowly for many who had lived it. Change began with Executive Order 9981, signed by President Harry Truman in 1948, which ordered the integration of the U.S. military. The Tuskegee Airmen's wartime performance had played a pivotal role in making that decision inevitable. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had led them through the toughest missions, became the first black general in the U.S. Air Force 6 years later. His rise symbolized a quiet but powerful shift. The Tuskegee Airmen had altered the trajectory of the American military. It wasn't until 2007 that national recognition finally matched their achievements. President George W. Bush awarded surviving Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal. Many were elderly, some in wheelchairs, but their pride was undimmed. For some, the honor came more than 60 years late. "They fought 2 wars," Bush said at the ceremony. "One against fascism abroad and one against discrimination at home, and they won both